Well, first of all, put it back again. Thank you very much for inviting me here. It always makes me nervous to be in between Charles Thornton and Bruce Wentworth because I am certainly not a physician and not a basic scientist and not of the caliber that you have in your myotonic dystrophy. So I'm honored to be here. I, like you, am an advocate. And this time, and in the New Yorker article, it talked about my two sons with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. They were diagnosed in 1984. I had never heard the word. You know, lots of people will say to you, myotonic dystrophy. I think I have an aunt whose uncle's brother's cousin had MS, right? I heard those same kinds of comments. I also heard comments like there's no hope and no help and your sons are going to die. They, in fact, followed the same progression that was predicted to me in that first day of diagnosis, and they died at 15 and 17. That didn't stop me from running around the world, borrowing a lot of money, trying to understand what the landscape looked like, and becoming an advocate. So I'm going to talk to you about our experience in clinical trials, and I hope that as I tell you sort of the good, bad, and the ugly of our experience, you'll be able to apply that experience as you reach this point in time in myotonic dystrophy, to really look at these clinical trials and to be able to change the landscape and the predicted outcome of your disease. So it's a really amazing place to be. So why are we here? Because this is an ecosystem just like we think about the plants and the rivers and the oceans, and we're in it. And I'm sure most of us didn't get here by choice. So we're in this ecosystem where there are patients and patient organizations, and where there are researchers and clinicians, and now we have the government and the NIH and industry. And so we make up this wonderful ecosystem of work that can, in fact, change a landscape. All right, everything that's important is here. I must tell you that Shannon Lord was a friend of mine. I used to be amazed at her questions and amazed at her advocacy, and I am terribly saddened by her death. But she and I agreed on this, that we begin and end with patients and families. That's the only thing that's important here. That's the most important thing. That's the priority, changing the landscape for the people we care about. So how do we do this? So when you're diagnosed with any disease, Duchenne, myotonic, any of these diseases that is really catastrophic in terms of trying to get your head wrapped around what is it, what does it mean, how will it affect your family. There are lots of sources of information, not all of them wonderful, but certainly there are sources of information. And then you can connect with other families by lots of different means. And this really brings the world together. I can tell you in 1984, I didn't know another person that had a child with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And it took me a long time to meet my first one. And I felt less alone. So what are our motivating factors? The first motivation factor is ourselves and the patient care and how we spend more time, improve the quality of life, and slow down the progression of these debilitating diseases. Then we have to look at our family and the emotional needs. We want to help other families. And finally, we have organizations that represent us and that we can serve on those organizations to help change the landscape just by ourselves and our involvement. So, a couple of factors. When I was just a mom at home with my children, and I still am just a mom, but now I have an empty nest. My two daughters are out of the house and on their own, and my two sons are not here. But I was an islander. I didn't pay much attention to medicine. I've been in medicine, I was a nurse, but most of the other people were sick and I was well. So it was really my delivering services. And I thought of myself as an islander in medicine because I didn't take any medicines. I really didn't like to see the doctor, only the one that lived in my house. He happened to be my husband, and the rest of them I didn't really want to have much to do with other than in my career. Then I became a consumer, and I started to pay attention. As I got pregnant and had my babies, I became a consumer, and I watched things, and I paid attention. And then, once I had children, I started answering a lot of questions. And that was because in my career, I was in adult medicine, because I had the view that children didn't get sick. And if they got sick, there was a really good reason. And frankly, one little child died in my arms in my intensive care unit at Ohio State. And I guaranteed myself that pediatric diseases would not be something I would be interested in because it was heartbreaking. So with my own children, I became a participant. I had to ask questions about all sorts of things, from viruses to vaccines. I had to ask about them. And then the boys were diagnosed, and I had to ask more questions. In fact, I developed a list of 100 questions, and I went to everybody I could. I lied my way into academic laboratories pretending I was a postdoc, and I often lied my way into medical offices telling them I was a physician with 2 children with Duchenne as patients, because I didn't want them to treat me like a sad mom. I wanted them to tell me what the landscape looked like so that I could figure out a way to help change it. And then, like all of you, I became an influencer. I became a person who went to conferences, who listened to scientific talks. I read scientific journals. I interacted with any clinician who would talk to me and any basic scientist that would talk to me. And then I went to Washington and tried to see if Congress might be interested in rare diseases such as Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And they are. And as you know, the Muscular Dystrophy Care Act was passed and signed into law in 2001. And with that, the muscular dystrophies from then till now have received $500 million in investment from the federal government. So, it's not me, it's all of you. It takes advocacy to get bills passed, so I'm thrilled to be a part of it. And we have lots of places to connect. Lots and lots of places growing all the time to connect to other families, to connect to other patients, to connect to each other, to look at the muscular dystrophies as a landscape that we can and will change together. So I wanted to share with you, we are at the point of clinical trials. And you might have heard we've had a few failures. We've had a few that were stopped because of side effects. But I wanted to tell you what we've learned. And that it's been difficult, and it is a difficult road, and it will be for you. But hopefully some of the things we've learned you'll be able to apply, and you'll be able to get around. So we share some similarities and some challenges. We're rare genetic diseases. They're variable even within families. They're progressive. They're multi-system. They require complex care, and as you all probably have experienced, that sometimes is not easy to find. They're debilitating, and they affect our families. We also need rigorous natural history, and I think for any of you who haven't participated in the natural history, aren't in the registry, get there and spread the word. The natural history studies are critically important. We have clinical variability, which is something you have to take into effect when you're looking at subsets of patients to test a given drug. And we want to know how to measure it, and Charles just told you the grip test is really surfacing to something as a primary outcome in myotonic dystrophy. In Duchenne, we're looking at the 6-minute walk test. And it's still quite difficult because when you're talking about children who are asked to perform a 6-minute walk test, sometimes they're quite distracted about lots of things. You know, I'd rather be somewhere else, I'd need a cookie. So the 6-minute walk test is difficult for us, and we're still looking. But this, for now, that's where we are. So here's the rules of those clinical studies, right? A study is a scientific procedure. It's an experiment. And that's what we have to think about. It's an experiment. I'm going to tell you how we thought about it as well. It's clinical. Their research is human volunteers. So people give informed consent and decide to participate in a trial. There's a protocol. It's a very specific protocol. It's the sort of the white lines on the road. This is what you have to do to participate in this trial. It has a purpose to enhance medical knowledge. In our hearts and minds, we wish it had purpose to cure these diseases, right, or to treat them. But its purpose is to expand medical knowledge. And there are different types of studies. There are clinical trials, observational studies, and other types of studies. But the kinds we're interested in are to test a compound or biologic or a genetic therapy to see if something could change in our disease. So you, the participant in these studies, you have rules as well. It's clinical research. You can't take part. It can't happen without participants. Each participant is going to make their own impact in this disease, in this trial. Their contributions are really appreciated, and all trials and outcomes are going to be different. So being a participant in a trial is a very rigorous process. It requires a lot of strength, emotional, spiritual, and physical strength to participate. So what the participant should know is this is voluntary. And informed consent is not the ticket in. It's something that's very serious that you sign. I'm afraid in some of our trials we felt that the informed consent was a ticket in to something we thought would just be approved. So I'll tell you a little bit more about our experience shortly. So it will mean in this trial that you will have standard treatment for the disease. But this is a layer on top of that. and it's going to offer the opportunity to examine an experimental therapy. So it may not make you better, it may make you worse. It may help, it may not. We may learn something, we may learn nothing from this. So this is how you find out. Go to clinicaltrials.gov and you can put in your disease and you can see the list of trials that are relevant to your disease. Now, here's our experience. So the doctor finds out about a trial. Sometimes you go to a clinic and the doctor will say, you will know more than I do about trials, and that's sometimes occurs. It's a bit frustrating. You have to fit the eligibility criteria. You're going to connect to a trial site. You're going to review the informed consent. You're going to decide yes or no to participate. You're going to have to go into these trials with your eyes wide open. I have to say, in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, our eyes might not have been so wide open those first few trials. Here's why. Here's the reality check. We did an expectation study about what do people expect going into trials, and what we found is that in advocacy, as in our organization, many of our families had been exposed to these wonderful, amazing ideas. So year after year, they would hear someone talk about the idea and where it was in the drug development process. Well, by the time that good idea had been heard about 6, 7 times in a row and got to the clinical trial, the families really felt like it was an approved therapy. It was sort of, why do the trial? We already know it's a great idea. We've seen it grow up and become a real drug, and now it's in trial. So there was this expectation that it already worked. In fact, when we talked to the clinicians, they had the same experience. They had heard about this good idea. They were enthusiastic. They knew the mouse studies. They had watched these patients progress, and they really want to do something that really impacts the disease course. So we all had this expectation that the drug works before the drug was tested. So you might imagine how hard it is to find out something doesn't work. So we all had unrealistic expectations, both the patients, the families, and the clinicians. Just gonna switch. So, and I want you to know that clinical trials have an impact on the entire family. So it's not the patient in the trial, it's the family with the patient in the trial. And it's a very broad impact around the family. So the burden of participation requires time. It requires time on the part of the family and all the family members as well as the patient. And that's emotionally and physically draining. Sometimes there are these really rigorous and impractical processes that you have to go through. And Charles mentioned a lot of them. And some of them are to sort through what's going to surface to the top. What are we going to really have to look in on to be able to decide if this drug works or not? So sometimes those processes seem a little bit overbearing, ridiculous, and just too much to do. But they're part and parcel of this. The travel demands can be excessive. When Charles just described the centers that are located around the country, Kansas, Florida, nationwide, or Ohio State, you may be traveling quite a bit, maybe every week, maybe every month, and you think to yourself, it's very exciting to be in a trial, but let me say to you, as those weeks go on, it's a burden of travel, and it really does weigh you down. It means different sleeping patterns, sleeping somewhere else perhaps. It just is a lot to participate in a trial. And you might be dealing with a CRO or a contract research organization because industry sometimes hires this middle guy. They're called CROs. The CRO is expected to know something about the disease, but I venture to say that they don't know enough, and they won't know enough in your mind. But there's sort of the gatekeeper between that trial and something that happens to you as well. And sometimes they're quite inflexible, sometimes they're not responsive, sometimes it's a struggle to deal with some of the CROs that you might come across. And there's more. There's a financial burden associated with trials. Some of our patients had to use their credit card for travel, which was reimbursed within an 8-week period of time, but some of our patients were carrying several $1,000s on a credit card that they really couldn't bear, and they were worried about, and it impacted other things they do. So they also had their own personal things to take care of, other child care, bribes for the children while this one little one participated in a trial. So I don't know about bribes for you all, but we bribe our children on a routine basis, and I have to say as a mother, I bribe my children and still try to bribe my daughters when I am able. So it was physically, emotionally, and spiritually burdensome to participate in a trial. And keep in mind, with these high expectations of this is the ticket to the drug that's going to stop progression, it really was difficult and continues to be difficult. So I think this is where, as influencers, you have to think about these trials, think about those CROs, Think about how these things are set up and what you can do to kind of get around some of these. The financial burden these patients in our trials carried was really one of the most significant factors. So I think that's important. We also, when you talk about benefit and risk, we've done a benefit risk study on a pilot study actually, and we looked and asked and surveyed 119 members of our community to ask what was the single most important thing in any drug that was being developed, and it was to stop progression, just like you on strength. So we wanted to stop progression. The second most important thing for these families was to find the best care and to have standard of care, and that was another reason for them to participate in trials. So the clinical trials, the path to success isn't simple and it isn't straight. It's much more like the squiggly line. That's what it really looks like. It's hard in the middle of that. But the idea is that we want to get to success. And so you're going to have to put up with a lot, but I think we all have to kind of say to ourselves, there's the goal in mind. And that's the goal we have to shoot for as advocates, recognizing that there is a burden to participation. And we're willingly going to accept the burden and hopefully work out some of the bumps beforehand. So the challenge is, boy, it's hard to be in a placebo group. No one wants a randomized clinical trial where there is a likelihood that you will be in a placebo group. So we have talked to the FDA and continue to talk to them about using the patient as their own control. This is why natural history studies are very important. It's unlikely that they'll accept that in any near term, but I think if collectively we as organizations keep going back to them and saying this placebo in a disease where there's progression and where every day matters and where doing nothing, having no drugs that really effectively treat the disease means we're doing harm because the disease carries on. So if we could get rid of the placebo, I think it's hard because it's very hard to tease out what is the drug actually doing. But if we had rigorous natural history, I have my fingers crossed that we could get around it. I think it's really important to understand when you're participating in clinical trials, the communication piece of this. The communication piece is critical. Patients need somewhere to go. They need to be able to talk to their clinical team. And I'm sorry if they all just run away now, 24/7. Sometimes in a clinical trial, we found these parents just going off the deep end, ready to quit the trial. Maybe their son got up in the middle of the night and started vomiting, and they had visions of all sorts of things. And as you know, it's the middle of the night, you're pretty tired, this child's vomiting, he's on a study drug, and you're thinking he's vomiting and then death, right? So you quickly kind of fall off the cliff. So I think having someone, a psychologist, nurse practitioner, someone that could answer the phone or be available to just answer questions and talk you off the cliff that yes, maybe this is okay, or maybe it's just the flu, right? Because it's very difficult to kind of stay on track when real things go wrong in a trial or there's worries on the part of the patient or the family member. Sometimes within the course of 48 weeks, which is a typical trial, it's not sufficient time to see what a drug really will do and see the full impact of the drug over time. So this is where our post-marketing studies are probably going to inform us in some ways much more than perhaps the clinical study. So we'd like to see a trend in a clinical study, and then we'd probably see post-marketing. So I think these are the things we have to think about as we participate in trials, as we sign on to that informed consent and say, I'll follow the rules, I'll stay in the white lines, I'm going to be a participant, I'm going to bear the burden because I know at the end of the day, this is the way to change the landscape. So, social networks. Here's the hard part about a clinical trial. You sign the informed consent, and sometimes in the social networks, we've seen patients say, oh, your son got to be in the trial, and my son doesn't fit the criteria. So it's hard to be on the outside. Sometimes it's hard to be on the inside of a clinical trial because other people would like to have been there. And you say it's hard, and they're sort of asking you, well, you're there, right? You're there in the clinical trial, and I'm on the outside. So not fitting the inclusion criteria as well as fitting the inclusion criteria can sometimes make a rocky path on the social networking and your interactions. And I think it's important to keep in mind. The other thing is you're not supposed to be talking about the trial. Now, one of our experiences is in one of our trials, one of the patients decided, because we're meeting up in these trial sites, right? This mom decided she would have the clinical trial group of this particular drug. So she gathered all the people, and she said, we're all going to talk about the drug. We're going to guess if we're on placebo. We're going to guess what dose we're on. We're going to look at our MRI studies and compare them, so we're going to post them on the site. And then she also invited some unbiased bystanders to come in, which included the other parents. Well, what happened is this was cut and pasted, and finally the group of several parents, the study involved a small number, was 25, and it was all over social networking. So I think it's really important to understand the informed consent and confidentiality. You're allowed to talk to your immediate family members. It probably isn't the best idea to judge the clinical trial on the social networking sites, because that sometimes can be the end of your trial. So it's very important, although it's really, really difficult, especially in your head if you think something's going well, you want to tell the whole world. But it's important that we as patients and influencers sort of follow the rules, although it's incredibly hard. So I think in trials, we have to find our own therapeutic dose of hope. We have to know that it's stair steps. We're going to start, it's going to be a plan, it's going to be a plan, analysis of the plan, more planning. This is a stepwise function as we get to the top of success. But we have to keep on participating, participate in those registries, participate in clinical trials, because it's important and it's the only way forward to change the landscape. So, here are my recommendations. I think you need to be influencers in these trials. They're tough. They cause a burden of participation. There's financial implications. There's implications on your families. We have to think about these designs of trials. We also have to think about them as customer service trials, right? We have to have a customer service feedback. I think about how Apple designed their computers. They asked people what they wanted. They designed a computer. They did a pilot and tested it, and then they went back and redesigned the computer, and now they have a 24/7 hotline for people like me who have no clue how to turn it on some days. So I think the same in clinical trials. We have to be thinking of a customer feedback loop. We have to be thinking of people that are available, that know something about the trial, that can help us through the difficult days, that can help relieve some of the burden, the emotional burden of participation, that can help us walk through. I think companies have to think this way in terms of customer service, because it's important. We are the customers. We are more than willing to participate in trials. We want the landscape to change, and we're dedicated to do that. But in return, we need a little bit of help to do it well. And I think we all should recognize that small things make an incredible difference. The first trials will maybe change the landscape a bit. They may improve something for a period of time. These could be first-generation drugs, and they'll be more efficient over time. So baby steps. The word cure is a difficult one. It's something we all want in our hearts, but I think nothing we can have for now. We're going to have baby steps until we are able to fully treat a patient, and that may involve a combination of therapies. But the idea is you're at the beginning of clinical trials that will change your landscape. Participation matters. It's hard, it's thrilling, it's exciting, and it's the only way forward. Thank you.